Hello everyone, I am Brian P. Easton, the author of the Autobiography of a Werewolf Hunter series. And this is Whiskey with the Werewolf Hunter.
This will never end, 'cause I want more. More, give me more, give me more. This will never end, 'cause I want more. More, give me more, give me more. If I had a heart I could love you. If I had a voice I would sing. After the night when I wake up.
Good evening all, and welcome back to the Werewolf Bar for your September edition of Whiskey with the Werewolf Hunter. We're glad you could be with us tonight to discuss a little monster hunting, whiskey, and other shenanigans. But first, the whiskey. Our creature of the night is a venerable whiskey, Old Crow Bourbon. Now, if you know about whiskey at all, and even if you don't, you have probably heard the name Old Crow bandied about in reference to this particular whiskey. It is one of the earliest whiskeys to come out of Kentucky, the earliest bourbons, I should say. Originally distilled by Dr. James C. Crow in Frankfort, Kentucky back in the 1830s. Now, over the years, it's changed hands a number of times, seen a lot of transitions, and since 1987, it's been distilled by the same people who bring us Jim Beam from Beam Suntory. So it's basically Jim Beam that's been aged for a shorter period of time. Now, like I said, Old Crow is a legendary liquor, legendary enough to warrant a parody product in the form of what was orange blossom honey back in the, I think late 60s, early 70s. Old Croak is what they have here, embalming fluid. Like I said, it's actually just honey, but this one's been never been opened. Kind of a collector's piece, but so legendary enough to have its own lampoon type of a product. It's said to have been the favorite whiskey of American legends like Mark Twain and William Faulkner. Even the original gonzo journalist, Hunter S. Thompson, was said to like it. So in that company, I guess I better like it too. Huh? So we're going to give it a try tonight here at the Werewolf Bar. I make no promises to you. Well, I've had worse. I guess I have to say that I hope Old Crow hasn't always tasted like this. I mean, it's a little watery, and it's kind of a bit of a bite that tastes, I don't know, a little dirty, maybe. It's kind of a chalky aftertaste. I mean, it doesn't even really taste like a young Jim Beam to me. But I'm going to go ahead and say Old Crow's glory days are probably behind it, even if it is the same mash bill and distilling process. But I'm not going to cast too many aspersions here, because let's face it, we have become spoiled in this country in so many areas of our lives with the preponderance of selection in almost every category. And whiskey is certainly no exception to that. So like I said, I've had worse. It's not quite the legendary taste I was hoping for, but it will serve. So as you may or may not be aware, the Winter Fox Journals Book 2 became available at the end of last month. And the Kindle edition of that book just dropped about a week ago or so. The jury's still out on whether or not there's going to be an audible version of this one. It's not really up to me at all, but is between the narrator Basil Sands and Permuted Press, the publishing house. So if you do want to see, or hear rather, this latest edition in the life of Michael Winterfox on audiobook, give the folks over at Permuted Press a shout. Let them know you want to hear it. I'm also happy to report that our newest project, which is the Legends of the Werewolf Hunter Book 2 anthology, is on the right track. We've had a few finished stories that have come in, and the rest, according to our authors, is right on schedule. The plan is to have those drafts in our hot little hands by the end of next month. And so that way we can have plenty of time to get everything together and have it in your hot little hands by the first quarter 2024. If this is your first time hearing about the new anthology, let me give you the rundown. Plus, we have our own Amanda Rogers, Mr. W.J. Pittman, and Miles Booth. And just to recap, for those just joining us, the anthology is like the first one we did a couple of years ago. It's comprised of stories adjacent to the autobiography of a werewolf hunter books. That is, that each story shares some connective tissue with the original stories. Be it the original trilogy or the Michael Winter Fox journals. In some stories, it might feature a returning character or two. Other stories may explore questions that weren't answered or explore other avenues related to the canon series. Maybe a combination of all of those. The point is, we have a talented crew of authors bringing you tales from the world of the Sylvesterverse, as I call it. And since we're on the subject, the mythology of Michael Winter Fox and Sylvester Logan James is filled to the brim with weapons of different kinds and different eras, from shotguns and rifles to pistols, bows and knives. The werewolf hunter's arsenal is varied. And to help us take a look at some of these weapons, we have Tex Grebner, who not only discusses the basic armaments, but also examines other more obscure weapons which could be weaponized against the beast, like he did a few gems back with the sling. So it's the same kind of case this month's edition. Here's Tools of the Trade with Tex.
Howdy folks, Tex Grebner here with Whiskey with the Werewolf Hunter, Tools of the Trade. We're going way back, and I'm talking 50,000-year-old technology. But this is also way back for me, because this here window behind me was one of the first casualties of my research and development efforts. I was probably 6 years old. 6 years old when I tied 3 yo-yos together and spun them in a bolos at a post in the yard. And the cordage that was holding those yo-yos into a bolos couldn't handle the force multiplication. One of them snapped off and sailed through this window here. Now, just a little bit of background. I spent the first 12 years of my life in the house that I live in now, moved out, and then came back and ended up renting the house that I live in now. But there's plywood on this window because my inner child is essentially an insurgency. However, the bolos, balls, and cordage here, this is basically 50,000-year-old technology. This one is made out of lead duck decoy sinkers. Each of them is 6 ounces apiece. Cable clamps for high tensile fence wire. Garage door cable. And obviously I have electrical tape on here so that I don't spike myself on my cable ends and so that it doesn't tangle. But you do not, at least in any physics that I know of, hold a bolos like this to throw. Maybe if you are chucking it into a flock of geese or landing waterfowl, this is the most intuitive way to hold a bolos, right like this. Because as you can see, that naturally splays in the wishbone formation. Now I say that this is 50,000-year-old technology. This here is essentially Punisher comic book level of vigilante garage build equipment. As I said, my inner child is basically an insurgency, but even a primitive bolos would kill a man. I highly doubt that without the capture of Montezuma, that between the Atlatl and the bolos, that Cortez could have taken what he took. Because this is a huge force multiplier. A huge force multiplier. When you spin this and let her fly, a primitive bolos would 100% kill a man. A primitive bolos, if you were in fact to take church shards and braid them into your cordage, you could spin this and sling this into the legs of a mammoth. And if it wrapped, and it wrapped tightly enough, that mammoth would hamstring itself as it walked. Now normally this is currently used in more modern times in South America against the rhea bird, but you could, if it were legal, I'd have to check, but you could use this against a flock of Canadian geese to break a wing, break a neck. This is normally used on humans to attack the legs, but if you were to throw this at the neck, as it wraps, as the circumference of the wrap gets smaller, these things speed up. A primitive bolos would 100% kill a man. This is going to kill you deader, I guess. Again, as I said, my inner child is an insurgency. Now, as this pertains to monster hunting, it's basically comic book vigilante level of garage building here. Because I cannot be trusted with creativity. In the immortal words of Darkwing Duck, let's get dangerous. I figured out how to take a 50,000-year-old human weapon design and use garage door cable and fishing sinkers to make something incredibly dangerous that, quite frankly, Green Berets would be proud of in a Red Dawn situation. But I wasn't satisfied with that. No, I was not. I took the same concept of the bolos, and instead of balls, I used Bud K or Smoky Mountain knife forks, I can't remember where I got them from, grappling hooks. So I'm going to be showing you the carnage of a grappling hook bolos. Yeah. I can't be trusted with creativity. Ooh boy. Now the traditional bolos would normally be clay balls formed inside of rawhide that would then be kiln baked so that they were solid, but the rawhide would give enough cushion that they wouldn't necessarily shatter. So you would make rawhide pouches and kiln dry it, attach your cordage, and then create your 3-pronged wishbone style bolo. Now, traditionally speaking, this is essentially 50,000-year-old technology. I've updated it comic book level, lunatic fringe vigilante level, but the traditional bolos would be clay balls formed inside of rawhide pouches and then kiln baked. The rawhide would provide cushions so that the clay balls inside would not shatter, and using either vegetable or animal cordage, you would create the wishbone shape of the bolos, and you would throw it at game. One of the main uses, theoretically speaking, of the bolos against 4-legged animals would be if you were spear hunting and you blew a stalk. You would use your bolos to trip the animal on its back legs if you couldn't necessarily stun it by hitting it in the head. You would trip the animal and then make up the distance where you could get your spear thrown into the animal. But as I said, it's highly theorized that a bolos lined with church shards could hamstring a mammoth or a large Irish elk from the before 4 times. But in this current configuration and its original configuration, it's a huge force multiplier. Whether you were talking about 4-legged critters, 2-legged shitbirds, or some form of beast. Again, the world is your oyster when it comes to being dangerous against forces that no one takes seriously. But here on Tools of the Trade, we take the lunatic fringe seriously, because my inner child is an insurgency, apparently.
Tex has a marksman's eye, doesn't he? And what a great idea to showcase a primitive weapon like the bolo. Tex pointed out a couple of times that bolos have been around for millennia and used around the world in one form or another. Here in the Americas, they've notably been used by Incan warriors, Inuit hunters, and probably most notably by South American gauchos. We can even see its principles at work a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. If you remember a certain incident on Hoth between an Imperial AT-AT and a snow speeder and its tow cable. This ancient design is also being marketed to 21st century police forces in the form of a Bola wrap gun, which fires 2 pellets connected by Kevlar, a cord of Kevlar, and on each end of the pellet there are small treble hooks, like fishing hooks. And it's propelled through this gun. The cord wraps around the legs of your suspect. The hooks hook in the clothing or the flesh, and they are inhibited at best and distracted at least. So with all that in mind, it's not a stretch that this primitive technology could be utilized in the war against things that go bump in the night. Specifically, if we're talking about werewolves and the kind of grappling hook bolo that Tex just tested there, a couple of large, sharp, silver snagging hooks would most definitely pierce woven flesh and cause a lot of pain and damage if said wolf decides to keep coming after you. And it's going to take some starch out of its attack if it doesn't. Now, of course, with all thrown weapons of this kind, the hunter is always going to be at a disadvantage regardless of their skill level, simply because a human being's natural reflexes are vastly inferior to that of the beast. And so when we theorize the potential of these kinds of weapons, we inevitably assume a best case scenario for the hunter. And that's the kind of thing we like to talk about. And Tex does a hell of a job of bringing it to us every month and always impresses us with his weapons prowess and his accuracy. So that's my dust up. Thank you, Tex. And you know, Michael and Sylvester aren't only proficient in weapons, but are expert hand-to-hand combatants as well. both of them trained in the warrior tradition of the Redosnan as part of the Northern Cheyenne Dogman Military Society. Both of these guys are practically as deadly barehanded as they are with a weapon in their hand. And the Redosnan Order, a highly mystical institution, also involves things such as spiritual combat. Here with a question now that goes right to the heart of that discussion is Amanda, with Amanda Asks.
Hey Brian, hey Internet. It's the Wolf's Hour here, and I just can't sleep. I can't stop wondering. In your spirit realm, the Great Death Bear is a real thing, and when the knight, gracious Graf, whatever his name was, when he shows up to help Sylvester, he looks like a giant angel. Does that mean that all the gods and goddesses and representations of all sorts of mythology are real on the spirit plane in your mythology? Or does that mean that they're all representations and they show up how you believe them to be, just based on like whatever's the real spirit there? Or am I overlooking this entirely and it's more like clay? It molds itself based on what's in your own mind. It's really got me wondering, Brian. I hope you got an answer for me. You guys keep wondering too.
Okay, so what Amanda is referring to here takes place in the second book of the original trilogy, Heart of Scars. Sylvester has been brutalized practically to death after escaping from an asylum where he was being held prisoner. He is rescued, shall we say, by a man named Graf Rudolf State, who is not only a werewolf hunter himself, but a medically trained and operationally modern Greek Orthodox knight. Here, Graf Rudolf has done about all he can do for Sylvester physically. He's bound his wounds, he's splintered his fractures, and he stitched his gashes about as well as anybody under lantern light inside a cavern could have. Now, with Sylvester hanging between life and death, the knight kneels by his bedside and begins to pray for him. But he's not just praying, it's intercession on Sylvester's behalf. In fact, Graf Rudolf's prayers go beyond the normal realm of petitioning God to save Sylvester's life, and they veer into the realm of spiritual warfare, where Rudolf himself kind of becomes an active participant in the proceedings. The evidence of this comes from Sylvester's point of view, of course, which is in a realm where the death bear is trying to devour him, trying to swallow him whole. And he sees this large golden-skinned being that he likens to an archangel. And this being appears and begins to do battle with the great bear of death, prying the creature's jaws open to allow Sylvester to get free from what will almost certainly be his demise otherwise. So the question before us from Amanda is essentially, why is it an angel and not, say, some other form of champion? In other words, if Graf Rudolf happened to be devoted to deities from, say, the Greco-Roman pantheon instead of the Orthodox Church, would it still have been an archangel that came for Sylvester's defense, or would it have been some kind of iteration of Hercules or Perseus or any number of other warrior champions of that mythos? And this is a good question, but it's a little bit trickier than some of the others that we've dealt with here on the show. And we kind of have to look at what it means, first of all, to engage in spiritual warfare. Now, the problem there is that there are many possible definitions and types of spiritual warfare, none of which are necessarily correct over another. Plus, the very ethereal nature of spirit combat makes it difficult, at least, to assign logical, reasonable criteria to it. It makes it very difficult because what's happening is sort of like a fever dream, a vision, or a hallucination that you might see under the influence of certain substances. But you see, none of this makes it any less real. You've heard it said by Michael and Sylvester both that there's nothing more real than a dream to a Cheyenne. And I don't want to get too far into the weeds with this, but what's happening with the archangel is not that Rudolph himself has become this being, nor is it, like Amanda suggested, some kind of clay, which has molded according to his beliefs and to fit them. In this scenario, under whatever rules of engagement exist for spiritual warfare according to Christianity, Rudolph's intercession has invoked a celestial spirit in the form which Sylvester identifies as an angelic being. Now, whether this was an actual archangel or a throne or a dominion, if you know your angelic choirs, it's really immaterial. What's important is that it was a real benevolent spirit fighting on his behalf and summoned by the prayers and somewhat guided by Graf Rudolph. However, calling back to our original comparison between mythologies, this does not mean a servant of Odin would have necessarily called forth the departed spirit of Beowulf or, say, a Valkyrie in the same way. Why? Because there are all manner of ways spiritual warfare might express itself. I'll give you, for instance, from earlier on in the same book, in fact. At the beginning of Heart of Scars, Sylvester wants Michael to teach him how to pass to the other side the way he does it, the way Michael does it, which is to leave the body, and the spirit journeys into those kinds of realms. Now, so far, Sylvester has only done this through the black drink or other sacramental rites. And he wants to go to the lands of the dead to try to find his wife, his departed wife, because he thinks if he can see her one more time and say a proper goodbye, then maybe he can let go of the hatred and the feud and just live a normal life. Michael shows him how to do it. And while Sly does see his wife and child, they are not as he anticipated. In fact, they are stuck between the teeth of the great death bear. And what ends up happening in this foray into the Gulf of the Dead is that Sylvester is met by the spirit of Pietro, aka Peter Stub, who is the big bad of this particular novel. It's a confrontation that does not end well for Sylvester. He takes a beating, a spiritual beating, that plays havoc on his mind, his will, his emotions, and the only thing saving him from Pietro is the idyllic version of Michael Winterfox, who appears in his prime, the perfect shaman and the perfect warrior, embodied into this manifestation of Michael, not as an old man, but a perfect manifestation of a Radosnan warrior. And Michael is able to back down Pietro and bring Sylvester back to his body, all the worse for wear. Now, while this does sound a little bit like what's happening later with Rudolph, the distinction here is that Michael himself appeared, not as an old man, but as a full-fledged Radosnan war chief. How and why? Like Rudolph, Michael was praying on Sylvester's behalf. But he wasn't on his knees with his hands folded, because that's not how Michael prays. Michael is Northern Cheyenne. Michael prays in smokes. So he is smoking his prayers to Maheo, the great mystery, the wise one above, the great spirit, if you will. And in this instance, Michael does what is commonly referred to as astral travel or astral projection. And the spirit expressed itself as the indomitable warrior that Michael still was inside, in his heart, right up until the very end of his life. And not the frail old man who took a beating earlier from some hooligans. Two different situations, same focus, Sylvester, but two different petitioners. And I can see how that might make the question Amanda has asked us a little more complicated, but it is a complicated question. because of the transcendent nature of what we're talking about in the first place. Anyway, I hope that answers your question a little bit, Amanda. And if you have a question you'd like to have answered on the show, be sure to send it to Amanda at the email address you saw at the end of her segment. Anytime you start discussing supernatural activity and phenomena, things get pretty Byzantine pretty quickly, even for those who are in the know, which is one of the reasons we've been presenting Dr. T. Broussard in his Doc Talk Shop primer here on Whiskey with the Werewolf Hunter. Doc has an encyclopedic knowledge of the occult arts and sciences and has been sharing his thoughts with us on a variety of different subjects, the metaphysical, that you will find in the book series. He's here now to help us make some sense of some more things the doctor is in.
Hello and welcome to Doc Talk Shop as part of Whiskey with the Werewolf Hunter. Tonight, on this rather auspicious reaping moon, we'll be discussing a rather interesting and somewhat personal topic with regards to the world of Sylvester Logan and werewolves in general, and that is the subject of voodoo and vampires. Now, when we speak of voodoo, we're speaking of what is essentially the shamanism of southern West Africa, in particular Yoruba and Benin, as has been transplanted to the Caribbean and the southern portions of the United States, mostly in Louisiana. In fact, Louisiana voodoo or New Orleans voodoo is considered by some to be its own tradition, its own subsect, if you will, of voodoo. Voodoo in general can be generally divided into four main groups or nations. These nations are Rada, Congo, Petro, and Santeria. In Rada, you mostly have a religious tradition. They tend to focus on healing, commerce between the living and the dead, tending to ancestors, removing of curses, things like that. In Congo, we're much more mystical bents. They have more of lore brought into South America, into voodoo, as a large focus on dreaming in trance states outside of the standard ritual for voodoo, which is dance. What we think of as voodoo in the movies, when it is shown anywhere near realistically, we think of a big dance and near strumming and so forth. Well, that's mainly Rada voodoo. And Congo deals with things like prophetic dreaming and other kinds of trance states. Now, Petro deals with what we would think of as sorcery or witchcraft. They tend to involve parkour or people that work with both hands. They tend to be mercenary in their approach to voodoo. They do things the priesthood, the Hungans, and the Mambos will not. So I mean, want your curses or your so-called voodoo dolls done, which are really fetishes, you would go to a Petro Bakur. Now, it's in Petro that you have the intersection between voodoo and lycanthropic transformation. And with Santeria, you have the Hispanic world coming into voodoo with elements from Cuba and Yoruba as well. And these four nations are by no means the end of it. You have each of these in its own tradition, and they have all sorts of substrata and subsects and lines. And in some places, they actually converge. You'll find things mixed up. So that reflective of life itself, the path voodoo is infinitely evolving. For example, in Africa, the male high priest or Babaloa is the main custodian of the tradition. But in the New World, in New Orleans, for example, you have the rise of the so-called queens, and they were the primary custodians of the tradition, and that's where the tradition of Marie Laveau comes in. And she was the one that combined the worship of the lower voodoo gods with Catholicism in New Orleans, and that has spread literally all over the world and through many traditions. Now, in the case of werewolves, you have those elements of voodoo that touch on things like the Abaquois or leopard people or the Cochon-Gris, the Great Pig Society. And in both those cases, the power of transformation and predatory spirituality is seen as being part of one of the many secret societies within voodoo. In other words, there's the public religion of voodoo, and then there is the hidden sects, the unorthodox sects, the magical sects, and they operate much more like a mafia than a religion, frankly. And membership in those was typically the power of lycanthropic and vampiric transformation. So that, for example, in the New Orleans Voodoo Tarot, you will find that there is a card known as the Secret Society. And the image for that card is a gathering of Loup-Garou. And that represents the fact that those that attend those meetings, those secret groups, were seen by the people as being not human. They're seen as being Loup-Garou. And of course, that extends into the kinds of acts that these secret groups would perform that involve things like cannibalism and other such actions. In fact, there are accounts of, to be a member of some of these groups, you have to supposedly perform acts of cannibalism. And these people would often use the pretense of voodoo to extort money from people and things like that. That's not to say that they don't believe in what they're doing. They do believe in their power, but they use it in ways that the priesthood, the Hungans, and the Mambos would not. Now, there are cases of Bakurs or sorcerers masquerading as Hungan and Mambos, or of Mambos and Hungans going bad and thus acting like the core. But keep in mind that if one is a member of the priesthood, traditionally one would not do the things that a sorcerer would do, although they do require the knowledge so that they can undo certain things. Now, before I go deeper into the subject with what's happened with Sylvester and the werewolf and voodoo, I'd like to address one more thing. There are other traditions that involve Brazil and the Afro-Caribbean traditions like Umbanda that some do not see as connected with voodoo because of the difference in terminology and the involvement of grimoire magic with the more Afro-Caribbean practices. I, on the other hand, consider cults like Umbanda as part of the Pedro nation, although an Orthodox part of that, to be sure. Now, my rant out of the way. When Sylvester went up against the werewolf with the help of his voodoo allies, they were aware of the werewolf spirit because, as I've said, those things are part of their tradition as well. And so they took a bit of what they could get of the werewolf and they bound it in a canary. In voodoo practice, you'll find that there are two kinds of spirit vessels they mainly use. You have a gove for a spirit of an ancestor, that you would keep and you would honor and you'd make offerings to. That's how you would communicate with a relative. And you would leave this gove in the keeping of your high priest or your high priestess, and they would tend the soul of your relative, your ancestor, through this object. You also have a canary. Canary is a similar type of vessel, but it is used to control spirit more. It is mainly used in the making of various types of zombies. So when they took the werewolf's spirit and bound it in a canary, they were in a sense taking control of it or trying to making it a kind of a zombie, which is how they were able to bind him and so forth with the water and so on. Now, because the werewolf spirits are powerful, their control over him was limited. But by binding the spirit in the canary, they are able to ensure that he will not return, because in voodoo belief, as in Cajun belief, the loup-garou or loup-garou is thought to be in some measure immortal. A slain loup-garou or loup-garou can be brought back by the grave being disturbed or by the skull taken and used in a ceremony. You can raise the being up, and with the right ceremony and the right amount of time, the idea is that the loup-garou will rise up. So when they bound the spirit, they were making sure that there was no way for him to come back. And this also gave them power over any remaining descendants of that particular werewolf, because in their thinking, and the most magical thinking for that matter, any person who uses a particular tradition is bound to the spiritual power of the ones that came before them. For example, if I had an apprentice and somehow my power was bound after my death, any of my apprentices, if I had any, would be weakened because their power flows from me and so forth. In theory. Now, it's important to remember that when we talk about werewolves and voodoo, we might agree on some principles from the European tradition and the voodoo tradition, but there are going to be some differences as well. So, my point is that Sylvester's paradigm and that the voodooans don't have to align 100%. The importance of alignment comes in the fact that they both recognize a threat and they're working toward dealing with that threat cooperatively, each within their own tradition. I mean, Sylvester's not going to require them to start working in a native way simply because he's native or part native. And they're not going to require him to, find his master of the head. They work well together because they each work along their same lines with their own individual ways. See? Now, while you find mostly leopard and boar transformations coming out of Africa, it's in Haiti that you really see the intersection with the European werewolf and baboon, because the type of transformation described is more along that of the werewolf than any other phenotype, albeit with invocation of the Loa versus invocation of infernal spirits and things like that. Now, it's interesting to note that in some strains of voodoo, as in some strains of French black magic specifically, you'll find both invoking the same entity, Papa Laba, the Father below, one as a Loa and the other as ostensibly the devil or the chthonic expression of God. So there you have two different paradigms, and yet they're addressing essentially the same entity with the same name from two different perspectives. And given the amount of history in both, seems to work because they wouldn't keep doing it if it didn't work in some measure. My point in a lot of this is that the werewolf in voodoo, as in many other traditions, represents an outlaw spirituality. It is crossing lines of taboo. It is functioning as an avatar of vengeance or justice, if you want to put a positive spin on it. And on the other hand, it's an embodiment of greed and power, if you're not looking to be politically correct about it. An interesting element that Verdun often brings out in some of the rituals involving lycanthropes is an admission or acknowledgement of the centrality of the transformation. You'll find transformation being linked to ecstatic dancing and more often than not some sexual release in a way that you don't normally find in Western lycanthropic rituals, except in rare cases. There are specific examples in Western occultism involving mysteries of Asmodeus that do involve sensuality and lycanthropy, but it's not as prevalent as it is in Verdun. Now, it's in this milieu that my own tradition of Lugaria, a term I coined many years ago, comes into play because a lot of my work falls within that gray area between Verdun from Africa and the New World and so on, and Western or European occultism. And that's where a lot of my work falls. So that's where Lugaria, or the way of the Lugaru, comes from, in that space between. Its bridge, if you will, between those traditions. Had one of my ilk been involved in the scene with Sylvester and his allies, they would have had an easier time of it because a Lugarian would know what forces from each tradition to use to more nullify the spirit of the werewolf they were fighting, and that would allow the more martial or mundane aspect of what Sylvester was doing to be even more potent, because without the spiritual foundation, the savagery of the werewolf does not have enough force behind it. Claws and teeth are great, but without the spiritual force behind it, you're dealing with no more than an animal, if you like, in terms of power. So without the spiritual power, the threat, though still large, is in fact diminished. Not completely, sadly, but you're still dealing with a lessened threat than you would be otherwise. So, with that, I will say, mind the moon and good hunting.
Thank you, Doc. One of the things I love about Doc's presentations is how he can make everything so relatable. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about sorcery or spirits or Lugaru. He's always able to present the information in such a way that I think is just a gift, and we're lucky to have him as a regular contributor here on the show. Now, Doc talking about New Orleans and Sylvester's adventures there reminded me that I've recently revisited the case of Silas Piper, who became the rabid werewolf. And I'm revisiting this because of something to do with the upcoming anthology. But it occurred to me, listening to Doc talk about the different spirit vessels used to house the souls, that Mr. Piper himself has led a pretty tortured existence from the time Diego not only marked him, but simultaneously infected him with rabies as well. One minute he's a human being, albeit a despicable one, according to the text. And the next minute he's not only a werewolf, but incurably insane as well. And if that's not good enough, he gets put down by a weapon that essentially rips him in half and spends eternity as a prisoner in a jar. If he were to be raised, as Doc suggested was possible, would he even know who he was anymore? Would he know who he used to be? Would he still be rabid? Would he still be a werewolf? Questions for Amanda, maybe, for another time. Well, it's last call here at the Werewolf Bar, and I think I'll finish this shot of Old Crow and show you something you might get a kick out of. You might find it amusing anyway. So back in the early 2000s, I was putting the finishing touches on the first book, which was then entitled When the Autumn Moon is Bright, an autobiography of a werewolf hunter. I was in desperate need of some kind of a decent art, some kind of decent cover art for the book. And now back then I was self-publishing through iUniverse, which was one of the first self-publishing print-on-demand outfits there was out there at the time. But at the same time, it still felt a lot like a vanity press without the high price tag. And it cast a pretty long shadow, which is neither here nor there except to say that to compensate for this long shadow, I felt like I needed to really have a good-looking book cover to compensate. I didn't have much money, certainly not enough to hire an artist of any respectable caliber, but I still found myself browsing through galleries on the internet looking for someone who I might be able to work with. One such artist in particular completely captured my attention with a black and white piece that he had done, which featured a fierce-looking wolf, symbolically positioned in the sky with a full moon for one eye. The artist's name was Bruno Crepal from Portugal, and the piece he had done was my first, last, and only choice to be the cover for that first book. I had very little hope, though, that he would first even respond to me through elfwood.com, I believe is where I found his galleries. And two, that he would actually allow me to use the image commercially. And if that wasn't stretching my luck enough, the image in question wasn't exactly suitable for my use as it was. And so not only would he have to let me use this image for free, but he would also have to alter it a little bit to fit my needs. But I love the piece that much, and I had to give it a try. I had to summon up the gall to write and ask him for all of that. Bruno said yes to all of the above, and I am forever grateful to the man for that. So what I want to show you right now, before we wrap things up tonight, is the before and after shot of that image, circa 2000. Take a look at this. And the rest is history. I appreciate you coming by tonight to spend some time with us, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. Be sure to like and subscribe on your way out. And you can find me, as always, at www.werewolfhunter.com, and you can send me an email at brian@werewolfhunter.com. That'll do it for us this evening, but be sure to join us next month for our Halloween episode, and until then, happy hunting and mind the moon.